Every year on the 21st of April, Romans could keep the birthday of their city. The date gave Rome a beginning that people could name, return to, and build ceremony around. And the difficulty is that the birthday belonged to memory more than to any recoverable record. That distinction matters, and it asks to be stated with care. A founding myth is not merely a tale to be dismissed because it contains gods and omens, exposed infants, and impossible survivals. A founding myth is a public inheritance. It tells a community where it believes it came from, what dangers shaped it, what violence it survived, and what kind of power it was willing to defend. The Romulus tradition belongs to that world. It is no diary from the 8th century BC. It is Roman memory, carried in festivals and monuments, coins and shrines, family display, political argument, and the physical places of the city itself. A Roman could walk through Rome and meet, street by street, reminders of the twins and the wolf, the founder's hut, the sacred boundary, and the first king whom later generations both honored and feared. The ground beneath the tradition is real, and it speaks more slowly. Archaeology gives villages near the Tiber and a useful river crossing, defensible hills, wet valleys drained by degrees, shrines and burials, walls and public spaces taking shape across generations. What it does not give is one clean morning when a single founder stood upon the Palatine and made Rome appear. So the useful question is not whether a wolf truly nursed two boys exactly as later Romans told it. The useful question is why Romans kept returning to this beginning. Why begin with twins? Why make the first boundary sacred? Why set a brother's death at the edge of the new city? Why remember Rome as a refuge for outsiders, fugitives, and unwanted men? Why make the first king both founder and danger? Romulus matters because his name gave Romans a way to speak about Rome before Rome could speak about itself. In his tradition, the city begins with abandonment and rescue, rivalry and violence, welcome and coercion, order and ambition. And the beginning is not clean because Rome did not imagine its power as clean. It imagined greatness as a thing made from rough beginnings, and then spent centuries arguing with the beginning it had chosen. Livy, writing in the age of Augustus, warned that events before Rome's foundation belonged more to poetic tradition than to firm historical record. The warning does not make the material worthless. It tells us how to listen. The early tale should not be treated as a modern report, and it should not be thrown away either. For Roman writers and priests, the great families and the later rulers all used it to say what kind of city Rome had always been. The date most often fastened to Rome's foundation was 753 BC, and it should be heard as a Roman convention rather than an eyewitness mark upon time. The later chronologies worked backward from king lists and family traditions, public records and guesses at the length of reigns. The date belongs here because Romans used it. It cannot prove the foundation, as a contemporary inscription could. The physical setting stands firmer. Early Rome grew beside the Tiber, the river that runs through the city and binds inland Italy to the coast, and a crossing point on that river mattered, because people and animals, goods and armies had to move through the landscape. The hills near it gave settlement higher and drier ground. The valleys between could become gathering places only after the water and the mud had been mastered. The Palatine was one of Rome's central hills, and later tradition fastened Romulus to it more firmly than to any other. The Capitoline became the great sacred and political height of Rome. The Forum Valley, in later ages the civic heart of the city, began as low ground that needed draining before ever it could grow famous for temples and assemblies, speeches and public life. And the Tiber was never scenery. It was the line of movement that made the site useful and vulnerable in the same breath. The twins come first. Founding traditions often begin with one hero because one hero is easy to follow. One child is saved, grows up, receives a destiny, and builds a city. Rome begins otherwise, with two boys who share almost everything. Romulus and Remus are born before Rome exists. Their mother, Rhea Silvia, belongs to the royal line of Alba Longa, an older Latin city in the Roman tradition. Their father is said to be Mars, the god of war, and their enemy is Amulius, the ruler who has seized power and fears what the boys might become. Amulius orders the infants exposed, abandoned outside all protection, and left to die. Before Romulus is a founder, before Remus is a rival, they are two children who should not survive. But survive they do. The river does not kill them, their basket comes to rest, a she-wolf nurses them, a shepherd's household raises them. And when they are grown, they recover the knowledge of who they are, overthrow the usurper, and restore the older royal line at Alba Longa. The rescue belongs to a wider ancient pattern, for exposed infants and hidden children, divine fathers, animal rescues, and the return to power appear in many old traditions. The Roman version becomes its own because survival does not lead on into harmony. A single saved child would have made an easier beginning. Twins make the beginning more troubled. Both boys have survived the same abandonment. Both carry the same royal blood. Both are bound to Mars. Both have courage. And both can imagine a place at the center of the future. Rome needs a founder, and the tradition gives it two possible founders. The difficulty is easy to understand, for shared beginnings do not always make shared agreement. Families know this, and communities know it. People can come from the same house, endure the same hardship, and still disagree about what should happen next. Rome set that familiar trouble at the start of its own memory. The first danger is therefore a danger from within. It is not an army outside the walls, nor a foreign king marching on the city. It is a brother standing beside a brother, so near in claim that the choosing between them becomes dangerous. Romulus gives Rome its founder. Remus gives the foundation its first unresolved claim. Together, they make the beginning less tidy and more powerful, for the first struggle over Rome comes from inside the closest bond the tradition could imagine. The next image is the boundary. Once Romulus and Remus both stand near the future city, the land itself must be marked, and in the Roman tradition, Romulus traces the line of the new city with a plough. A plough belongs to farming. It cuts the earth so that a field can be worked. Here it turns land into civic space. Inside this mark, a city is beginning. The earth is turned inward as the plough moves, and the detail matters, for the ground is being gathered into the future city. Rome is not merely being measured, Rome is being claimed. At the places where gates will stand, the plough is lifted. A gate is not a broken boundary, it is a controlled opening. It lets people enter and leave, and it reminds them that entering matters, for there is a difference between crossing anywhere and crossing where the city permits. Later Romans connected this kind of sacred city line with the pomerium, the religious and legal boundary of Rome. It was not simply a wall, and not only a military defense. It helped define Rome as a special civic space, where authority and religious rule and public identity were ordered differently from the world outside. That may sound technical, and the idea is familiar to anyone. Many communities keep lines that are more than physical marks. A doorway is more than timber when it parts home from street. A courtroom is more than a room when people enter it under a different kind of authority. A border is more than a line on a map when it changes who holds power, who has protection, and what rules apply. Rome's first boundary works in that way. It says that this place is not merely a camp, a village, or a useful hilltop. It is a space with a special claim upon the people inside it. If the boundary were only practical, the foundation would be a construction scene, a hill chosen, a settlement marked, a wall built. That would explain where Rome stood. It would not explain why Rome mattered. A sacred boundary does a stronger thing. It parts the city from ordinary land. It gives the founder's line religious weight. It turns crossing into an act with meaning. Once that line is drawn, people are no longer dealing only with soil and stone and timber. They are dealing with the first visible sign of Rome's authority. The boundary gives Romulus' claim a visible form besides. The brothers have both survived, both hold claims, both stand close to power. Now one of them draws a line and says, in effect, this is the place, this is the limit, and this is the city I am founding. For Romans that mattered deeply, because their public life came to care greatly about limits and offices, rituals, and the lawful forms of authority. Who had the right to command? Where did that right apply? What sign showed that the gods accepted it? What boundary parted civic space from military space, public office from private ambition, citizen from outsider? Before Rome has a Senate house, before it has roads or provinces or empire, it has a line. The line protects and the line excludes. It creates belonging and it creates someone outside. It makes the city visible and it invites a test from anyone who refuses its authority. That is why Remus crossing matters. If the line were only a mark in the dirt, stepping over it would be mockery and nothing more. If the line is Rome's first sacred limit, then crossing it becomes a challenge to the city before the city has fully begun. Rome's first boundary is sacred because the city begins as more than a place. It begins as a claim about land and authority, belonging and divine approval, and the rules that might hold a rough human gathering together. Then comes the death at the boundary. Remus crosses the line or mocks it and he dies. In some tellings, Romulus kills him with his own hand. In others, another does the killing, while Romulus bears the meaning of the act, and Livy's version preserves the severe lesson fastened to the moment. So perish whoever else shall cross my walls. The death can feel shocking, because the offense seems small if the boundary is imagined as ordinary construction. A brother jumps a low wall, a brother mocks a brother's work, and in daily life that should end in anger, not in death. But the tradition has already made the line more than earth. It is the first sacred limit of Rome, the visible sign that one brother's claim has become the city's claim, and Remus does not merely step over ground. He tests whether the line has force. That does not make the killing morally easy, and the tradition is not asking us to find it easy. Rome's first act of order is joined to violence inside the family, and the city that later spoke endlessly of law and office, citizenship and public duty, remembered a brother's blood beside its first boundary. Fratricide means the killing of a brother, and the word matters because a brother is not a stranger. A stranger can be pushed away as foreign, an enemy can be named as outside. A brother belongs close enough that the violence feels like a wound in the household itself. That is why Remus mattered so much to later Romans. Rome's later history was marked again and again by civil conflict, violence within the same political community, Roman against Roman, families split, armies following commanders against other Roman armies. After such things, Remus could sound less like a distant figure of legend and more like an old warning. Many communities prefer to remember themselves as beginning in agreement, in purity, or in shared noble purpose. Rome kept a beginning in which the founding line makes a victim almost at once, and the victim is the founder's brother. This makes the boundary more powerful and more disturbing in the same breath. The line protects the city, and the line kills. It creates an inside, and the first excluded man is no foreign invader. It gives Romulus authority, and the authority carries guilt from the start. The human difficulty is not remote from us. Communities are often built around lines that solve one problem and open another. A rule can protect a group while hurting someone close to it. A decision can make order possible while leaving a wound that is remembered long after the practical problem has passed. Rome set that cost at the very beginning. The death of Remus stands at the edge of the city because Roman memory joined civic order to danger from the first. The city needs a boundary, the boundary needs authority, the authority is tested, the answer is violent, and the violence never quite leaves the memory. From exclusion, the tradition turns to admission. Romulus has drawn a line around the city, and a city cannot live as a line alone. It needs people. It needs households and labor, defense, worship, and the generations to come. That is where the asylum enters. An asylum in this setting was a protected place where outsiders could come and be received into the new community, and Romulus' asylum was remembered on the Capitoline. It drew men from beyond the first circle of the city, outsiders and fugitives, debtors and criminals, displaced men, and others who needed a new beginning. This is one of the most revealing images in the whole tradition. Rome does not remember itself as a pure bloodline growing naturally from one noble house. It remembers itself as a gathering, and the asylum makes Rome larger by accepting the very people whom other communities might distrust or reject. The memory wears two faces. On one side, it is strength. A city that accepts outsiders can grow quickly, turning strangers into neighbors, neighbors into citizens, and enemies into future allies. Rome's later power leaned heavily upon that ability to absorb people beyond the first core. On the other side, the memory could sting. If Rome began with runaways and debtors, criminals and displaced men, then Roman greatness had mixed origins, not the tale of one flawless people spreading from a perfect beginning, but the tale of people who needed a place and of a city willing to take them in. That remains a recognizable kind of pride and discomfort. Many cities and many families carry histories made of migration and shame, reinvention and survival. Rome set that uncomfortable truth near its origin and remembered greatness as something made from people who had not all arrived with honor attached. The asylum creates the next problem in its turn. A gathering of men can become a defensive settlement quickly. A lasting city needs households. In Roman thought, a household was not only a private family. It was the basic unit through which property and children, status, worship, and inheritance moved across the generations. Rome has gathered men, and it does not yet have women enough to become a settled people. Romulus therefore sends envoys to the neighboring communities, asking intermarriage and alliance, intermarriage meaning recognized marriage between groups, not merely private affection between persons, a public way of turning separate communities into kin. The neighbors mock the request. One insult asks whether Rome has opened an asylum for women too, and the joke lands because it names Rome's weakness. The new city has men enough to fight, and not women enough to continue itself as a civic body. The Roman answer, in the tradition, is the seizure of the Sabine women. The Sabines were a neighboring people of central Italy, remembered here as one of the communities from which the women were taken. The setting is a festival or games, the kind of public gathering that should have meant hospitality. Instead, Roman men seize the visiting women and carry them into the city. The episode has often been softened in later art and retelling, and the violence should remain visible. The older phrase, the rape of the Sabines, can confuse a modern listener because the word can cover abduction and sexual violation inside one violent tradition. The core event is coercive seizure, women taken, because the new city cannot gain lawful marriages by consent from its neighbors. War follows between Romans and Sabines. Fathers and brothers, husbands and the new Roman community are drawn toward bloodshed, and then the women themselves enter the battlefield space, some carrying infants, and plead for the fighting to stop. They stand between their birth families and the men who have made them wives by violence, and their appeal stops the fighting and leads to a mixed community. That does not erase the coercion that began the episode. It shows how Roman tradition imagined incorporation, the bringing of outsiders into the civic body, making them part of Rome rather than leaving them forever foreign. The Sabine women, forced into the center of the conflict, become public actors whose appeal makes a joined people. Rome grows by absorbing those it has injured and those it has fought. That is uncomfortable, and it is central to the way Roman memory explained Roman strength. Rome remembers itself as a refuge because the later city needed an origin to match its habit of expansion. It did not become powerful by staying pure. It became powerful by taking people in, binding them to Rome, and turning outsiders into partners in Roman life. And the tradition gives that policy an ancient face, while refusing to hide the force and the injury that could travel with it. Romulus, then, becomes more than the man who drew the line. Later tradition makes him the orderer of the people within it. He gathers the outsiders, gives the community its shape, and turns a rough settlement into something that begins to look like a state. That is why so many institutions are fastened to his name. The tradition credits him with the paters, the early fathers or leading men who become the root of the Senate. It joins him to patronage, the system that bound powerful protectors to dependent clients. It gives him military ordering, lictors, and the signs of command, lictors being the attendants who carried the fasces, the bundles of rods that stood for the power to compel. We need not believe that one 8th century founder created every later Roman institution in finished form. The memory is doing something more revealing. It makes Romulus the figure who turns rough human material into civic order. He gathers people, ranks them, binds them, arms them, and gives command a public shape. A founder gives the city a face. Instead of describing generations of settlement and drainage, alliance, conflict, and slow political formation, the tradition can point to one figure and say, "Here order began." People often understand institutions more easily when the institutions wear a man's name. But Romulus is dangerous too. The man who gives order also rules. The founder who gathers outsiders also commands them. The figure who guards the boundary also carries the memory of a brother's death. He is necessary to Rome's beginning, and he is never harmless inside it. The danger grows sharper because Rome later hated kingship. After the monarchy ended, the word king, rex in Latin, became poison in Roman public life. Romans could honor authority and office, command, ancestry, and military glory. The idea of one man standing above the civic body as king remained a threat. Romulus sits at the center of that tension. He is Rome's first king, and later Rome wished to define itself as the community that escaped kings. He is the founder, and the power he stands for can look like the very thing the Republic feared. The city cannot discard him, for he is the beginning, and it cannot make him entirely safe, for he is also a ruler. Even his death keeps the uncertainty. Some traditions said Romulus vanished in a storm and was taken up among the gods as Quirinus, the divine figure associated with Rome and in later Roman understanding with the deified founder. Other traditions suspected that the senators murdered him and hid the killing behind a sacred account. One version makes him divine, the other makes him politically dangerous enough to remove. Together, they show how uneasy Roman memory remained around its first king. Later Romans kept him everywhere. They had the Ficus Ruminalis, the fig tree linked with the twins, the hut of Romulus on the Palatine, images of the wolf and the infants, the cult of Quirinus, funeral displays, coins, and sacred sites. These were not neutral keepsakes. They were ways of making the founder present inside later Rome. A coin could carry the wolf and twins through daily exchange. A hut on the Palatine could make archaic poverty visible inside a city of marble. A sacred tree could turn a legendary rescue into a place on the city's map. None of these objects proves the literal childhood of Romulus. Each proves that Romans wanted the childhood kept publicly within reach. By the 1st century BC, that presence had become politically charged. Rome had been shaken by civil war, by dictatorship, and by the fear that one man might refound the state by becoming its master, and in that world Romulus was attractive and dangerous at once. To be a new Romulus could mean healing Rome after chaos. It could also mean acting like a king. Rome made its first king both founder and danger because the city needed a beginning and needed also to remember the risk of gathered power. Romulus could explain order. He could explain command. He could explain why the city mattered. And he reminded Romans that a founder can stand too close to a king and a king too close to a master. At the end of the Romulus tradition, Rome has not received a simple origin. It has received a difficult one. The Rome of the ground and the Rome of memory tell different kinds of truth. The ground says that communities near the Tiber became a city slowly, through settlement and drainage, worship and defense, exchange and public building. The tradition says how Romans gave that slow growth a human shape, twins and a river, a wolf and a hill, a boundary and a killing, an asylum, abducted women, a mixed people, and a founder who could be remembered as king and god together. Romulus is less useful as a man to be reconstructed than as a memory to be understood. He is the name Romans fastened to a set of claims about themselves, that Rome could make citizens of outsiders, that Rome could turn defeat, exile, and shame into strength, that Rome could draw a line around a community and hold the line sacred, that Rome could absorb the people it had fought, that Rome could build order out of violence, and then insist that the order mattered. But the danger stays in view. The first Roman boundary has a dead brother beside it. The first king gathers the unwanted and rules them by force. The city that later hated the name of king kept its first king everywhere. The Romans did not forget the contradiction, they carried it with them. Handled this way, the myth becomes historical evidence of a high order. It does not prove every event it describes, it proves what Romans were willing to remember. It shows what they could admit about their city and still call greatness, and it shows why later Romans, above all in seasons of civil conflict and political refounding, kept returning to Romulus when they needed to ask what Rome was becoming. Rome did not only inherit a founder, it inherited a question: whether a city born of mixture and violence, refuge and command, could turn those beginnings into law, citizenship, and common life. The answer was never settled once and for all, and that is why Romulus stayed alive in Roman memory. He was the beginning Rome wanted, the beginning Rome feared, and the beginning Rome could never quite leave behind.